Hello there and welcome. Before you get too comfortable, do consider liking the video and subscribing so you won't miss any of these quiet journeys into the past. And if you feel like it, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Tonight, we turn our attention to something so quietly woven into the fabric of human life that we hardly ever give it a second thought. Yet for centuries, it has been our companion in both the most mundane errands and our most profound reflections. We reach for it absent-mindedly, scribble notes, sign names, underline passages, or perhaps doodle in the margins of an old envelope. It is the pen, that unassuming instrument of ink and grip, carrying the thoughts of millions across time and space. But before it became a plastic staple in every office drawer or a treasured heirloom on a writer's desk, it passed through countless iterations, shaped by the needs, materials, and imaginations of different eras. From the earliest scratches on soft clay to the rustling of quills against parchment in drafty medieval halls, to the pocket-sized precision of the 20th century ballpoint, the story of the pen is, in its own way, a quiet history of civilization itself. It's not the sort of history marked by conquest or spectacle, but rather by small shifts in daily habits, the needs of scribes and students, and the slow perfection of tools meant simply to carry our words. And so, as we begin this gentle exploration, let's slow our minds to the pace of ink drying on paper. Let's sit beside a monk carefully copying a manuscript by candlelight, or stand over the shoulder of an inventor tinkering with a new reservoir system. Let's feel the subtle weight of a well-balanced pen in hand and appreciate the soothing rhythm of writing, letter by letter. Tonight's journey isn't hurried. It's a soft meander through the centuries, following the flow of ink from reed and feather to chrome and cartridge. There's no need to stay fully awake for every detail. Just let the words wash over you like rain on a window pane as we drift gently through the long and quiet history of the pen. Long before pens, long before the notion of writing as we know it, there were hands reaching out to shape, to scratch, to mark. And there was dust, soft, yielding earth. The earliest records of human expression are not written with ink or graphite, but with finger and stone, pressed into damp clay or drawn into sand. These first gestures were tentative, practical, and often ephemeral. A tally of livestock perhaps, a simple line to indicate direction, a pattern sketched in the dirt to explain or remember or simply to pass the time. In Mesopotamia, thousands of years ago, people began shaping marks more deliberately. Clay tablets, still moist from the riverbanks, offered a medium that could be shaped, dried, and preserved. Styluses, at first simple sticks or bones, became the first true writing tools. Held in hand and pressed with care, they left behind wedge-shaped impressions known as cuneiform. The method was deliberate and slow, each sign requiring a gentle pressure, an angled touch, and a moment's pause. These were not pens as we know them, yet they carried the same essence, the transformation of thought into a traceable mark, a quiet transaction between mind and matter. It is easy to imagine the rhythm of it, sitting cross-legged in the early morning, tablet resting on one's knees, the soft, earthy scent of clay rising with the warmth of the sun, as each careful impression took shape. There was something grounding, almost meditative, in the act. In ancient Egypt, a different tool emerged, the reed stylus. Cut from river plants and shaped to a point, it was dipped in soot-based ink and applied to papyrus. Here the writing was less about indenting and more about fluid motion, curves and strokes, flowing symbols. The act of writing became quieter, less percussive. One could imagine the scratch of the reed against papyrus, the swish of robes, the rustle of palm fronds in the wind. The tool may have changed, but the intention remained the same, to capture fleeting thought in something lasting. Much of early writing served administrative needs, inventories, decrees, contracts. But in time, it also began to preserve prayers, poetry, and memory. Through each small tool, from bone stylus to sharpened reed, we see a deepening relationship between the hand and the mind, a growing trust in the written word to bear witness, to outlast the day. Writing tools began to vary by region and purpose. In China, brushes made of animal hair were used on silk and later paper. The soft, calligraphic strokes brought a different kind of intimacy. The act of writing became almost painterly, flowing in elegant motions that required balance and breath. Each character was not only a word, but a form of art. Even today, the gentle sound of brush on paper remains one of the most peaceful noises one might hear in a scholar's room. These earliest implements, styluses, reeds, brushes, were bound by their materials. A stylus needed soft clay, a reed could fray, a brush could lose its shape, and yet each bore within it the seeds of the pen. A tool designed not for grandeur, but for clarity, for the simple act of making a mark. Over time, the emphasis shifted from the mark itself to the act of making it. A finer tool meant a finer script. Scribes learned to shape their letters not only for utility, but for grace. In monasteries, in market stalls, in dusty classrooms, people began to seek tools that would better keep up with the pace of thought and the demands of record. So while the first marks were drawn with whatever lay closest at hand, a stick, a bone, a shard of pottery, the long arc of writing would lead towards refinement. A desire for permanence, yes, but also for ease, for comfort, for beauty. The pen would come, in time, but first, there were these modest beginnings, in dust, in clay, in papyrus and reed. Quiet, humble tools, yet essential. They shaped not just our words, but the very way we learned to see and remember the world. If we listen closely enough, there is a rhythm in ancient tools, a quiet percussion that echoes not through great halls or roaring battles, but through small, patient gestures. The way a hand moves over a tablet, the soft press of a stylus, the drying of ink in the sun. And in that rhythm, we find the beginnings of writing. Not in grand proclamations, but in the measured strokes of reed on clay. The reed pen, simple and yet remarkably effective, found early prominence in the Fertile Crescent, where the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates yielded not only life-giving water, but the very materials that would shape communication itself. Reeds grew tall and dense, their hollow stalks easily cut and shaped to a point. It was the scribe's task to select, trim, and sometimes split the tip, fashioning a primitive nib capable of holding ink, however briefly. This was no mere scratch across a surface. Writing with a reed required a delicate balance of pressure and angle. Too firm, and the ink would blot or the nib would splinter. Too light, and the marks would fade before they were made. Yet in skilled hands, the reed pen offered remarkable clarity, sharp lines and fine control, capable of rendering not only numbers and names, but flowing scripts of elegance and consistency. Paired with ink made from soot or ground minerals mixed with water and gum, the reed pen transformed how ideas were captured. On papyrus, itself a marvel of early technology made by pressing and drying the inner pith of the papyrus plant. The reed danced. dry, fibrous, yet surprisingly flexible, papyrus accepted ink without bleeding, offering a smooth, almost parchment-like surface on which words could settle. The result was not only more legible than clay, but lighter, easier to transport, and far better suited to long texts. While clay tablets were cumbersome and fragile, papyrus rolls could stretch for meters, bound in bundles, rolled into tubes, or stored neatly in scroll cases. And with them, knowledge could move, not only within a city or a court, but across empires. Still, clay retained its place. In Mesopotamia, the cuneiform script persisted for millennia, etched not with reed pens, but with styluses. These were often triangular in cross-section, made from bone, ivory, or metal, and pressed into the moist surface of clay. The stylus didn't draw, it impressed. Each wedge-shaped mark was a physical indentation, a small act of sculpting, and once baked, the tablet became a near-permanent record, durable in ways papyrus never could be. In the great archives of cities like Nineveh and Babylon, thousands upon thousands of these tablets were stored. Invoices, contracts, prayers, proverbs. The clay bore no pretensions of artistry, yet it held the weight of civilizations. Even now, when one runs a finger across such a tablet, there is a palpable sense of connection. The grooves made by another hand, long stilled, yet still legible across the centuries. The choice between reed and clay was not merely about materials, it reflected differing philosophies of writing. Clay was about record, fixed, weighty, meant to endure. Papyrus, more fleeting, was about flow, the unfolding of ideas, the spread of messages. The reed pen belonged to the latter. It facilitated speed, elegance, and breadth. In Egypt, reed pens became almost emblematic of the scribe. Tomb paintings depict them tucked behind ears or stored in long, slender cases. Scribes were held in high esteem, trained from youth, often associated with the divine. For to write was to mirror creation, to bring form from formlessness. The god Thoth, keeper of wisdom, was himself a scribe, and those who wrote in his image wielded the reed as a sacred tool. Even the act of preparing ink became ritualized. Powders were ground on smooth palettes, mixed with water, and sometimes perfumed. The ink could be black or red, the former for general text, the latter for headings, corrections, or emphasis. A scribe's tools were simple, yet deeply symbolic. Pen, palette, scroll. Together, they formed the backbone of a literate society. Elsewhere, other forms emerged. In China, the brush would reign supreme, bringing with it a wholly different sensibility, strokes that breathed, characters that danced. But the reed pen, with its modest form and quiet reliability, held its place in the sun-baked lands of the Nile and the Euphrates. In time, it would yield to other instruments, to the feathered elegance of the quill, and later to the precision of metal. Yet even as it faded from common use, the reed left its mark, not only in the letters it inscribed, but in the very idea of the pen as an extension of thought, a conduit between mind and medium. There is a kind of humility in these early tools. They did not shout, they did not gleam, but they enabled memory. They preserved lore, love, lamentation. They wrote hymns and tallies and stories of gods. And in the quiet strokes of a reed on papyrus, we can still hear the gentle beginnings of a long and faithful companion, the pen. In the dappled light of ancient temples, where incense hung heavy in the air and the rhythmic chanting of priests echoed against sandstone walls, a different sort of sacred work was being done in the scribal chambers beyond. It was quieter here, hushed and deliberate. The soft rustle of linen robes, The faint clink of ink pots and the rhythmic whisper of pen on papyrus were all that filled the warm, still air. At the heart of it all was a tool so unassuming it could be overlooked, the Egyptian reed pen or calamus, carefully fashioned and held in skilled, steady hands. The calamus was taken from the stems of river reeds, most often from the plant Juncus maritimus, a species that grew in gentle abundance along the Nile's edges. Once cut, the reed would be dried, its end shaped to a taper, then trimmed into a fine chisel edge. Some were split slightly to allow for a narrow well of ink to gather, prolonging each stroke. The tool was delicate and needed regular sharpening, usually with a small knife kept close at hand. Yet in the hands of a trained scribe, it moved with confidence, not as an artist's brush, but as an instrument of measured clarity. These scribes, known as sesh, were more than mere clerks. They were stewards of knowledge, trained from childhood in the intricacies of hieroglyphs, hieratic and later demotic scripts. Their days were structured around repetition, recitation, and endless transcription. Young initiates would begin with simple signs, copying them over and over in ink upon limestone flakes or broken pottery shards, ostraca, before graduating to the sacred scrolls of papyrus. Papyrus, though fragile to modern eyes, was a resilient and workable medium. Crafted from the pith of the papyrus plant, cut into strips and pressed together with the plant's own sticky sap, it dried into broad, fibrous sheets. These were smoothed with stones, then rolled or sewn into scrolls. When a reed pen touched its surface, the fibres drank the ink with gentle restraint, not blotting, but absorbing, allowing for distinct and lasting lines. The ink itself was a simple affair, made from soot or charcoal mixed with water and bound with plant gum. Red ochre provided the reddish pigment used for special notations, headings, or names of deities. Stored in small earthen jars or on shallow pallets, the ink was always at hand, a quiet pool of darkness ready to flow into word. With these tools, scribes recorded the business of empire and the mysteries of the gods. They penned tax records and agricultural inventories, letters and contracts, hymns and funeral texts. In the hands of a royal scribe, the calamus wrote decrees that travelled down the Nile. In the solitude of a temple, it inscribed spells to guide souls through the afterlife. Much of what we know of ancient Egyptian life comes through these writings. Not the grand monuments, but the quiet notations on scraps and scrolls, written in black and red by careful hands. A tally of grain delivered, a letter to a distant cousin, a record of linen wrapped around a body for burial. The pen did not choose its words, it merely carried them. And yet there was a spiritual weight to the act of writing. The word was power. The act of naming, of recording, was believed to confer permanence. To write a name was to preserve it from oblivion. To speak the words of a spell aloud was one thing. To inscribe them with pen and ink was quite another. It was to give them lasting form, a kind of quiet magic. In tombs, scribes were sometimes depicted seated, cross-legged, scroll unrolling across their lap, stylus in hand. They were honoured not for wealth or conquest, but for their mastery of signs. Even in death, their tools followed them. Pen cases, ink palettes, small knives, and reed pens laid beside them as tokens of their life's work. The calamus, so light in the hand, carried great significance. It did not evolve much in form over the centuries. It didn't need to. Its balance, its ease, its quiet elegance sufficed. And as Egyptian civilization endured across dynasties, through invasions and dynastic shifts, the reed pen remained a steadfast companion to thought and record. Occasionally, in dusty corners of modern museums, one might still find an ancient writing kit, a wooden case with slots for pens, traces of ink, perhaps even a tiny whetstone for sharpening. There is something deeply human about these items. They speak not of pharaohs or gods, but of daily tasks and careful hands, of someone somewhere dipping their pen, breathing evenly, and beginning again. And so the reed pen, unpretentious though it was, became a thread running through centuries of Egyptian history. It enabled continuity, allowed wisdom to pass from teacher to pupil, from father to son, from one age to another. It did not clamour for attention, it simply did its work, line by line. In the quiet rhythm of ink-meeting papyrus, we find the pulse of an entire civilization, not in its monuments, but in its words. As the centuries turned and empires shifted, the landscape of writing slowly changed. In the cool shadows of European monasteries, nestled among candle-lit corridors and echoing cloisters, the pen too underwent a transformation. The reed, once prized in the dry warmth of Egypt, gave way to the feather, light, flexible, and full of quiet possibility. The quill had arrived. Feathers from geese were the most common choice, though swans and turkeys offered thicker shafts for broader hands. Each quill began its life in flight, drifting down from wing or tail, gathered and carefully selected. Only mature feathers were used, those toughened by time, with sturdy barrels and a gentle curve that nestled naturally between finger and thumb. The preparation was as much craft as ritual. The feather was soaked, cured in hot sand, stripped of its outer membrane, and trimmed to a neat point. A small slit at the tip created a primitive nib, capable of holding ink briefly before needing to be dipped again. Compared to the reed, the quill offered a new subtlety. It was springier, more responsive. It flexed slightly with pressure, allowing for thinner or thicker lines, depending on the scribe's touch. For those who had spent years with a calamus, the adjustment was not immediate, but soon the advantages were clear. Longer lasting, more expressive, and better suited to the vellum and parchment now replacing papyrus across the colder, damper lands of the north. Parchment was a shift not just in material, but in approach. Made from animal skin, sheep, goat, or calf, it was durable, flexible, and less prone to mold or tearing. Carefully stretched, scraped, and smoothed, each sheet was a quiet miracle of preparation. It held ink well, offering a surface that neither bled nor blurred. It was, in its way, a more forgiving canvas. The combination of quill and parchment brought about a quiet revolution in script. Gone were the blocky, formal characters of stone and reed. In their place emerged flowing scripts, elegant loops and ligatures. Writing became not just functional, but beautiful. The Carolingian minuscule, developed under Charlemagne's rule, offered clarity and grace. A standardized script that could be read and copied with ease. It laid the groundwork for modern Western lettering, its gentle curves still echoing in our printed pages today. In monastic scriptoria, monks toiled for hours each day, copying manuscripts by hand. The rhythm of their work was slow and deliberate, each letter formed with care, each page a labour of devotion. The quill, though simple, became a trusted companion, dipped into inkwells of iron gall ink. Made from oak galls, copper, and gum arabic, it glided across the page with quiet purpose. Interruptions were few, the occasional sharpening of a dulled tip, a pause to refill the ink, a moment's rest to stretch cramped fingers. Outside, the seasons changed, the world carried on. But within those thick stone walls, the act of writing held its own quiet eternity. Time slowed, the quill moved, the parchment waited. Not all writing, of course, took place in monasteries. Legal clerks, scholars, merchants, all began to adopt the quill. Letters were penned, ledgers filled, books slowly accumulated, yet the essential quality of the act remained unchanged. Writing was slow. It required presence, attention, a kind of stillness. The tools of the trade were few, but cherished. A knife for sharpening, a cloth for blotting, a smooth stone to burnish the parchment, and always the quill, shaped by hand, worn by use, replaced only when its barrel split or its point grew too soft to hold. Quills, like their reed predecessors, were impermanent. A single feather might last only a week with daily use. Yet they were easily made and deeply familiar. Some scribes kept a bundle by their desk, each shaped slightly differently. One for fine lines, another for broader strokes. Each had its feel, its weight, its whisper. In the great libraries that began to form, in Oxford, in Paris, in Bologna, books became more than vessels of sacred text. They became repositories of science, philosophy, medicine, law. The quill penned not only prayers but questions, observations, doubts. And with that shift came a subtle broadening of the pen's purpose. No longer just a tool of transmission, it became one of exploration. There is a romance to the quill that endures even now. Its curve, its texture, the faint resistance as it moves across paper. It reminds us of a time when words were given space, when the act of writing was slow enough to mirror thought, when a single page might represent hours of silent attention. And while the quill has long since faded from everyday use, replaced by more convenient and durable tools, its shape lingers in fountain pens, in calligraphy nibs, even in the stylized pens of modern logos. Its legacy is not just in the words it wrote, but in the way it shaped our relationship with writing itself. For in every curl of a medieval script, in every ink blot and flourish, the quill left its mark, quiet, deliberate, and unmistakably human. As the 18th century drew to a close and the world inched toward industrial transformation, the pen, too, began to change its form once again. This time, it was not nature's offerings, not reed, not feather, but metal that would come to define the next chapter of writing. The arrival of the metal-nib was not abrupt, but gradual and curious, a quiet evolution born from necessity, precision, and the patient tinkering of hands seeking reliability. Quills, though elegant, were fragile. Their points wore down swiftly and required frequent trimming. In the hum of growing towns, with clerks filling ledgers and correspondence flowing in greater volume, the humble feather began to show its limits. There was a hunger, subtle but persistent, for something sturdier, a pen that could keep pace with the rhythms of commerce and bureaucracy without the constant pause for sharpening. The earliest metal nibs date back further than many assume. Experimental versions appeared as early as the 1600s, often fashioned by hand and mounted into wooden or bone handles. But it wasn't until the dawn of the 19th century, in the growing industrial city of Birmingham, England, that metal nibs began to be produced in earnest. Birmingham, already a hub of fine metalwork, took naturally to the challenge. Here, small workshops began crafting nibs from thin sheets of steel, shaped through stamping, slitting, and careful tempering. The process was delicate. The steel needed to be just soft enough to flex, but hard enough to retain its shape. The slit down the middle allowed ink to flow smoothly, mimicking the split in a quill, while the curved profile gave the nib its spring. What emerged was not a flamboyant object, but a small marvel of engineering. It was replaceable, affordable, and, perhaps most importantly, consistent. A single steel nib could last far longer than any feather and could be produced in vast numbers. By the 1830s, pen manufacturers like Gillott, Mitchell, and Perry were making millions of nibs each year, sold across Britain and exported worldwide. These nibs were designed to fit into wooden holders, often simple cylinders turned on lathes or shaped by hand. The two parts, nib and holder, together formed the dip pen, a tool that soon became ubiquitous in schools, offices, and homes. It was not glamorous, but it was dependable, and it marked a turning point in writing, away from the artisan scribe toward the everyday writer. The ink remained much the same. Iron gall still prevalent, though commercial formulations began to offer more consistent results. Inkwells, too, became more refined. Ceramic, glass, even porcelain, often weighted to prevent spills. On countless desks, the gentle ritual unfolded. Uncork the well, dip the nib, let the ink settle, and begin to write. There was a rhythm to it, one that encouraged a steady hand and a deliberate pace. Though the steel nib lacked the personal charm of the quill, it brought with it a new kind of beauty. Manufacturers offered a wide range of nib styles, pointed, rounded, broad, oblique. Some allowed for graceful calligraphy, others were firm and utilitarian. The packaging was often ornate, tiny paper boxes embossed with gold, lined with velvet, offering dozens of gleaming tips like miniature treasures. In schools, children learned their letters with steel nibs. Ink-stained fingers and smudged margins became a familiar part of daily life. Copybooks taught discipline, loops and lines, the slow formation of each character. In offices, clerks recorded transactions, transcribed correspondence, and kept the machinery of bureaucracy turning with quiet efficiency. And at home, personal letters flowed more freely than ever before. News, affection, observation, all committed to paper with a tool now affordable to many. Writers, too, found the steel nib liberating. Charles Dickens, Lewis Carroll, and Charlotte Bronte all composed with dip pens, their words flowing steadily from slender nibs into longhand manuscripts. The steel nib demanded precision and patience, but it also enabled a new intimacy, a direct connection between mind and paper, unmediated by fragility. By the mid-19th century, metal nibs had become the norm, displacing quills almost entirely, and yet, despite their prevalence, they maintained a quiet dignity. They did not boast, they simply worked, hundreds of millions of them, silently shaping the written world. Factories refined their methods. The advent of rolling mills, hydraulic presses, and precision cutting allowed for even finer control. Nibs became cheaper, more standardized, and more widely available. The pen, once the mark of a scholar or a priest, had become a tool of the many. And still, the experience of writing remained personal, contemplative, a moment of stillness in an increasingly fast-paced world. Even as the fountain pen began to make its presence felt, with its self-contained ink reservoir and smoother flow, the metal nib endured. In calligraphy, in drawing, in the quiet corners of tradition, it found its home. There is, even now, a certain satisfaction in dipping a pen, in watching the ink darken the paper, in the pause it requires. It is a slower way of writing, and sometimes slow is what we need. So the metal nib, humble in appearance, marked a subtle but lasting shift. It made writing more accessible, more consistent, more democratic, and in doing so, it carried forward the ancient promise of the pen, to give form to thought, gently and faithfully, one line at a time. Ink, that quiet companion to the pen, rarely draws attention to itself, yet without it, the most finely crafted nib or precisely trimmed quill would be of little use. Ink is the unseen current beneath the surface of every written page, flowing, seeping, settling. its history is long and modest, a tale not of spectacle but of quiet refinement, of recipes passed through generations and the careful balancing of elements both mundane and mysterious. The earliest inks were humble affairs, derived from what was at hand. In ancient Egypt and China, soot, known as lamp black, provided a deep, reliable black. Mixed with water and a binding agent, such as gum arabic, it yielded a smooth, consistent fluid that dried to a rich, matte finish. These early inks were not corrosive and lasted remarkably well, especially when applied to papyrus or silk. They did not bite into the surface, but rested atop it, visible yet gentle, like a shadow. In China, ink evolved into an art form in itself. Rather than remaining liquid, it was often solidified into compact ink sticks, pressed and shaped with exquisite care. These were ground against stone slabs with water to produce fresh ink before each session of calligraphy or painting. The ritual of grinding was meditative, allowing the writer to settle into focus before pen ever touched paper. Ink was not merely a medium, it was part of the writing process, tactile, scented, calming. By contrast, medieval Europe saw the rise of iron gall ink, a more complex and potent formulation. Made by soaking oak galls, rich in tannic acid, and combining the extract with iron salts, this ink produced a blue-black mark that darkened over time as it oxidized. Gum arabic acted as a binder, ensuring the ink adhered well to parchment. Unlike soot-based inks, iron gall actually bit slightly into the page, making it harder to erase. This was especially prized for official documents and legal records, but iron gall was not without its drawbacks. Its acidity, while helpful for permanence, could also degrade paper or parchment over the centuries, leaving behind a brittle trail of darkened script, and sometimes even burning through the surface entirely. Scribes learned to manage its temperament, adjusting proportions, filtering impurities, and applying it with care. A well-made batch could last decades without thickening or moulding. A poor one could ruin a manuscript. Ink became more than just functional. It signaled intention. Black ink was standard, but red was often used for titles, rubrics, and sacred names. In illuminated manuscripts, gold and silver inks shimmered against deep blues and burgundies, their ingredients drawn from powdered metals and rare minerals. The preparation of such inks was a matter of patience and expense, reserved for the most treasured volumes, Bibles, psalters, royal records. As the centuries turned and paper replaced parchment, ink adapted again. The invention of printing presses in the 15th century demanded a thicker, oil-based ink that could adhere to metal type. But for handwriting, water-based formulations remained the norm. Commercial ink makers emerged, offering pre-mixed bottles of predictable quality. Chemists experimented with dyes and pigments, trying to improve flow, prevent clogging, and reduce fading. By the 19th century, writing ink was an established industry. Names like Stevens, Waterman, and Parker began to appear on inkwells and labels. Recipes became trade secrets. Inks were tailored for different purposes. From schoolroom writing to ledger entries to fountain pen use, some were fast-drying, others boasted extraordinary permanence. Colours expanded to include blues, purples, greens and browns, though black remained dominant in official contexts. The relationship between ink and pen grew ever more refined. Dip pens required thicker ink with a slower flow. Fountain pens demanded a more fluid consistency to pass smoothly through fine internal channels. A good ink had to dry quickly enough to avoid smudging, yet slowly enough to allow for steady writing. It needed to resist feathering, but not clog. And above all, it needed to remain stable, neither drying in the bottle nor turning sour with time. Writers often formed strong preferences. Some swore by a particular brand, others mixed their own concoctions, experimenting with ingredients in dusty corners of their studies. A well-loved ink might carry not just a hue, but a scent, a texture, even a memory. The way it flowed, the way it looked under candlelight, the way it settled into the fibres of the page. Even today, ink holds a certain allure for those who write by hand. Bottles of blue-black, emerald green, or sepia brown stand like quiet sentinels on desks and shelves. Their labels evoke an older world, a slower world, where writing was not a task to be hurried, but a moment to be inhabited. In an age dominated by glowing screens and frictionless typing, the return to ink is often a return to presence. The uncapping of a bottle, the dipping of a nib, the soft scent of pigment and gum. These small rituals ground the writer. They ask for attention. They offer in return a calm and steady rhythm. And so ink, that quiet flowing partner to the pen, continues its gentle evolution, from soot and gum to chemical dyes, from galls and iron to fountain-safe formulas. It does not claim the spotlight, it simply does its work, marking the page, one slow stroke at a time. There is a quiet kind of satisfaction in a pen that writes without interruption, that does not ask to be dipped every few lines, nor trimmed and reshaped, but simply glides, ink flowing steadily with each word. For centuries, such a notion was little more than a hope. But by the late 19th century, it became a reality. The fountain pen, with its self-contained reservoir and measured flow, ushered in a new era of ease in writing, not hurried, but gently uninterrupted. The idea itself was not entirely new. As early as the 10th century, accounts from the Islamic world mention pens with internal ink supplies, instruments designed to avoid the mess and inconvenience of ink pots. Yet these early prototypes were rare, handcrafted, and largely unreliable. Leaks were common. Ink flow was inconsistent. The dream of a pen that held its own ink would have to wait until materials and mechanics could finally meet. The 19th century, with its bursts of industrial ingenuity, provided just such a moment. Improvements in steel production, rubber vulcanization, and precision manufacturing laid the groundwork. Around the 1850s and 60s, inventors began filing patents for pens with rudimentary ink reservoirs, typically eyedropper-filled chambers held within hard rubber barrels. A small hole at the nib allowed ink to flow through by gravity and capillary action. It was, at last, a dip-free experience. But the real breakthrough came not from the reservoir alone, but from the feed, the hidden mechanism beneath the nib that regulated ink flow. Early designs often spluttered or clogged, but as feeds became more sophisticated, with tiny channels carved into ebonite or plastic, the ink began to flow with quiet reliability, matching the pace of writing with gentle precision. By the 1880s, fountain pens had become commercially viable. In America, Lewis Waterman, a New York insurance broker frustrated by a leaky pen, designed a new feed system and founded the Waterman Pen Company. His pens were elegant, dependable, and quickly embraced by professionals and students alike. Across the Atlantic, companies like Parker and Swan soon followed, offering their own variations, some with ornate gold nibs, others with simple steel tips, all promising the same thing: a smoother, more continuous writing experience. Fountain pens changed the rhythm of writing. Without the need to pause for dipping, thoughts could flow more freely. Pages filled more quickly. Writers could carry their pens with them, jotting notes in cafes, drafting letters on trains, filling diaries late into the night. The act of writing became more portable, more spontaneous, yet retained its intimacy, its slowness of hand. In schools, children were taught to fill their pens carefully, to twist the eyedropper or squeeze the rubber sac, to blot the nib gently before beginning. There was a certain ceremony to it, not elaborate, but respectful. Ink was no longer just an external supply. It lived within the pen itself, close and ready, like a heartbeat. Yet early fountain pens were not without their quirks. Leaks remained a nuisance. A sudden drop in air pressure could force ink to spurt unexpectedly. Pens needed cleaning and careful handling. The pocket clip was invented not just for convenience, but to prevent pens from resting nib down, a common cause of blotting. Despite these challenges, the fountain pen became a staple of civilized life. In offices, pens rested in desktop stands, polished and upright. In homes, they were laid neatly beside inkwells and blotters. Gentlemen carried them in waistcoat pockets. Ladies tucked them into handbags. A good fountain pen was a symbol of refinement, education, and self-possession. Manufacturers began to compete not only on function, but on beauty. Barrels were made from rich celluloid in marbled hues of jade, amber, and pearl. Nibs were engraved with delicate scrollwork. Caps clicked or twisted into place with satisfying finality. Some pens were modest and practical. Others were extravagant, gifted for anniversaries or graduations, each carrying a quiet pride. Writers, too, took to the fountain pen with affection. Virginia Woolf wrote with one. So did Ernest Hemingway. Their words poured from gold nibs onto thick cream paper, not for speed, but for presence. The pen became an extension of the hand, almost unnoticed in its loyalty, its quiet obedience. And yet, the fountain pen was not immune to change. As the 20th century unfolded and newer technologies emerged, it began to lose ground to the next innovation, the ballpoint. Cheaper, cleaner, more rugged, the ballpoint offered convenience where the fountain pen demanded care. And so, slowly, fountain pens receded from the everyday, not forgotten, but relocated to the quieter corners of writing life. Even now, they endure. In leather cases, on walnut desks, in the hands of calligraphers and letter writers, the fountain pen continues to serve. Its nib adjusts to its owner's hand over time, moulding subtly with use. It invites reflection. Its flow is not urgent, but measured. Its elegance is not ostentatious, but earned. To hold a fountain pen is to hold a piece of continuity, a quiet legacy of ink and thought, unspooling line by line. It does not clamour for attention, it simply writes. In the quiet parlours and gaslit studies of Victorian Britain, writing was both a necessity and a ritual. Letters were penned daily, journals maintained with solemn discipline, and correspondence carried out with a sense of propriety that extended far beyond mere function. It was a time when the act of writing held a certain gravity, not dramatic or theatrical, but quietly woven into the routines of daily life. And at the centre of it all was the pen, most often by mid-century the dependable dip or fountain pen, accompanied by inkwells, blotting paper, and a steady supply of crisp, folded stationery. Victorian households, particularly among the middle and upper classes, maintained writing desks with careful pride. These were not always grand or elaborate, sometimes merely a small folding table tucked into a corner, but they were orderly and well stocked. A pen rest, an ink pot, a stack of paper, perhaps a sealing wax stamp, everything in its place, ready for the moment when words needed to be set to paper. Writing was not confined to the solitary thinker or the professional clerk. It was a deeply social activity, shaped by custom and expectation. Letters served as the primary mode of communication across distance, a lifeline of thought and news, affection and duty. The morning post might bring a half-dozen notes, each requiring a careful reply before the afternoon collection, and so many began their day not with hurried tasks, but with quiet writing. At a desk by the window, sunlight slanting through lace curtains, the scratch of a nib marking time. Penmanship, too, was more than mere legibility. It was a mark of character. Young women were taught a sloping, elegant hand, light and graceful. Young men favoured a firmer script, not flamboyant, but clear and confident. Copybooks were a staple of education, filled with rows of proverbs and maxims, all designed to instill both moral and mechanical discipline. The Palmer method and Spencerian script offered guides to upright, harmonious letters, and many took great pride in their personal style, developing over time a hand as recognizable as a voice. The ink of the Victorian period had settled into reliable forms. Commercial bottles were widely available, labelled with names like Stevens or Arnold's, often housed in weighted glass pots to reduce the risk of spills. Iron gall was still common, but newer, less corrosive blends gained popularity for everyday writing. Some ink came perfumed, others boasted quicker drying times. The colour was typically black or dark blue, though sepia and violet found favour with more expressive correspondence. One of the subtler arts of the time was the folding of a letter. Paper was expensive, and envelopes, though growing in availability, were not yet universal. Many letters were written on a single sheet, folded inward to form their own envelope, then sealed with wax and addressed with care. The choice of seal, too, spoke volumes: a family crest, a monogram, or a simple flourish. Red wax was traditional, but darker hues came into vogue. The process of melting and pressing the wax carried a ceremonial stillness, a quiet, final gesture before the letter took its journey. Diaries and journals, meanwhile, became companions to many. The Victorians placed great importance on self-examination and moral development, and daily reflection was encouraged. Some entries were brief, a note on the weather, a record of visitors. Others were expansive, detailing thoughts, hopes, and doubts in long, meandering passages. The fountain pen proved especially suited to this work, offering a steady flow that mirrored the unhurried pace of private contemplation. In offices, the pen was put to more industrious use. Clerks and copyists filled ledgers with methodical rows of figures and transactions. Offices hummed with quiet diligence, the scratching of nibs, the soft clink of inkwells, the rustle of paper. Accuracy and neatness were paramount. Mistakes were corrected not with erasers but by careful blotting or with the use of a penknife to scrape away the error before rewriting. A sharp eye and a steady hand were considered essential virtues. The Victorians also delighted in novelty. Portable inkwells, pen wipers shaped like animals, combination pen and pencil sets. These small contrivances found their way into drawers and pockets, each with its own quiet charm. A travelling writing case, lined with velvet and fitted with compartments, was a popular gift for the literate traveller. Inside, a pen, a bottle of ink, spare nibs and stationery would be arranged just so, a small mobile sanctuary for the written word. Public letter-writing rooms were another feature of the age, spaces in railway stations and hotels where one might sit at a polished desk, compose a note, and post it before continuing on one's journey. Writing was not hurried, it was integrated into life's movements, a pause amid the bustle, a moment of clarity in a world slowly speeding up. And then there were the books, the explosion of print and publication, the rise of the novel, the diary, the essay. Many were penned by hand, in neat longhand, before being typeset for print. The pen was there for every draft, every correction, every margin note. Authors, editors, and printers all relied on its quiet presence, trusting it to carry thought into form. The Victorian pen was not a flamboyant instrument. It was modest, reliable, and omnipresent, a tool that invited thoughtfulness and rewarded patience. Whether tucked behind a schoolboy's ear, resting beside a lady's blotter, or poised above a clerk's ledger, it was part of the daily rhythm. And in that rhythm, that soft scratch of nib on paper, we can still hear the quiet heartbeat of a century that cherished the written word. By the mid-20th century, the pace of life had begun to change. The stillness of the writing desk, the unhurried rituals of inkwells and blotters, gave way to the demands of a busier, more mobile world. Letters were still written, forms still filled, thoughts still committed to paper, but the means by which they were written would undergo one of its most significant transformations. Quietly, almost unceremoniously at first, the ballpoint pen arrived. The idea was not entirely new. The earliest conceptions of a rolling ball to dispense ink date back to the late 19th century, but the technology proved difficult to realize with the materials of the time. It wasn't until the 1930s that a breakthrough was achieved, not in a grand laboratory, but in the quiet workshop of a Hungarian newspaper editor named Laszlo Biro. Biro, frustrated by the slow-drying nature of fountain pen ink and the smudges it left behind, began experimenting with a different approach. He observed how the quick-drying inks used in newspaper printing left no such marks, and wondered whether a pen might be designed to use a similar fluid. Alongside his brother Georgi, a chemist, Biro developed a mechanism in which a small metal ball seated in a socket at the tip of the pen would rotate as the pen moved, picking up ink from a reservoir and depositing it smoothly onto the page. It was a simple concept in appearance, but it required precision. The ball had to be perfectly round, the socket finely machined, and the ink formulated to flow without leaking or clogging. After refining their design, the Biros filed for a patent and introduced their invention at the 1931 Budapest International Fair. Interest was mild. The true impact of the invention would come later, during the turmoil of war. In the early 1940s, the brothers fled Europe for Argentina, where they perfected their design further. The Argentine Air Force, always in need of writing instruments that would function at altitude without leaking, adopted the pen for its pilots. This marked the ballpoint's first significant commercial success. From there, the pen's quiet revolution began. In 1945, an American entrepreneur named Milton Reynolds saw a demonstration of the Biro pen in Argentina and quickly developed his own version for the US market. His Reynolds Rocket became a sensation, advertised as the pen that could write underwater, upside down, or over grease. Its appeal was not in elegance, but in reliability and novelty. The fountain pen, once unchallenged, now had a competitor. Still, the early ballpoints were not without flaws. The ink was thick and tended to clump. The tips could skip or smear, yet the principle was sound, and improvements came quickly. By the 1950s, Marcel Biche, a French manufacturer, introduced a refined version of the ballpoint. Simple, disposable, and affordable. His company, Bic, would go on to produce billions of pens, their clear plastic barrels and blue caps becoming a fixture in homes, schools, and offices the world over. The ballpoint pen changed writing not just in form, but in tempo. It required no maintenance, no inkwell or blotting paper, no care in orientation or pressure. It could write for months, then be tossed aside. In classrooms, it became the standard, its affordability and ease displacing pencils and fountain pens alike. In businesses, it became the go-to for forms, ledgers, signatures. The pen was no longer a cherished object, but a tool, efficient, anonymous, reliable. Yet not all greeted it warmly. Some lamented the decline in handwriting quality, blaming the ballpoint's lack of resistance for sloppier script. Others missed the tactile satisfaction of fountain pen ink flowing from a nib, the ritual of refilling, the quiet weight of a well-made instrument. Still, the ballpoint pen marched on, indifferent to sentiment. There was something profoundly democratic about the ballpoint. It made writing accessible in a way no pen before it had. No special paper was needed. No special training. It worked, it lasted, and it required nothing more than a simple grip. It flattened the world of writing tools, making the act of putting ink to paper available to nearly everyone, nearly everywhere. And in this humble ubiquity, it became invisible. A pen was no longer a statement. It was simply there, on a countertop, in a drawer, clipped to a notebook. Its very ordinariness was its triumph. And even as computers and digital tools began to supplant handwriting, the ballpoint persisted, signing receipts, scribbling notes, filling in forms with quiet, unremarkable grace. Today, it is hard to imagine a world without the ballpoint. Its design has scarcely changed in decades. It is not a pen for those seeking flair or flourish. It is not romantic, but it is dependable. Quiet, unfussy, and in a small, consistent way, it has kept the written word alive, one smooth, rolling stroke at a time. During times of conflict, when the world tilts and routines are upended, certain objects become quiet constants, small comforts, practical tools, fragments of normalcy. Among them, the pen has always found a place. It may not appear on lists of wartime essentials, yet throughout the major wars of the 20th century, pens were present in pockets and rucksacks, in trenches and tents, in field hospitals and command rooms. In moments of chaos, the pen remained, modest, silent, yet essential. In the First World War, soldiers and officers alike carried pens as part of their kit. Correspondence was lifeblood, a means to tether one's thoughts to home, to pass on news, or simply to feel heard. Many used dip pens or early fountain pens, often filled with portable ink tablets that dissolved in water. Others resorted to pencils for convenience, but pens were preferred when possible, their ink lending a formality and weight to even the simplest words. Letters written from the front were often brief, constrained by military censorship and the fatigue of battle. Yet within those constraints, the pen performed its quiet duty. It captured reassurances, modest updates, and above all, affection. Each stroke a thread between the writer and the world they'd left behind. Mothers, sisters, sweethearts, children, all waited for that recognizable hand, that familiar flow of ink across folded paper. Officers kept journals too, recording troop movements, observations, and personal reflections. These were not always elaborate, a few lines scrawled by candlelight in the corner of a canvas tent, a note tucked into a breast pocket, the ink sometimes smudged with rain or dirt. Yet the pen endured, as it always had, as a bridge between thought and record. By the Second World War, the pen had become more robust. The fountain pen remained common, but new materials and manufacturing methods meant they were lighter, tougher, more suited to field use. Some were designed with screw caps or lever fillers, made to withstand jostling and exposure. Brands like Parker, Scheffer, and Waterman developed pens for military use, often in drab colours and compact sizes. And then came the ballpoint, not yet dominant, but quietly gaining ground. Its ability to write without leaking at high altitudes made it attractive to aircrew. Its ink dried quickly, resisted smudging, and functioned in difficult conditions. By the end of the war, the ballpoint had become more than a novelty. It was on the cusp of changing writing forever. Pens were used not only by those in uniform, but by civilians in wartime too. In bomb shelters and blackout kitchens, people wrote letters, filled ration books, signed registration forms. Pens bore witness to the administrative weight of war. Conscription, identification, requisition. They were tools of bureaucracy as much as intimacy. And in quieter moments, they wrote poetry, diaries, songs. In every war, there are those who write, not for history or instruction, but to make sense of experience, in notebooks worn thin, on scraps of wrapping paper, on the backs of photographs. Ink flowed. The pen allowed something of the interior life to survive, even when the world outside was unrecognizable. Some of the most poignant wartime writings are small in scale, a few lines in a soldier's diary, a child's letter to a father away at sea, a nurse's careful records kept between shifts. The pens that wrote them were not ornate. They were tools, but they carried a human touch through the fog of history. The military also relied on pens for more formal purposes. Orders were signed, intelligence reports drafted, maps annotated. In these moments, precision mattered. The clarity of a well-written line could prevent confusion, save time, even lives. In the press rooms and planning tables, pens traced the arc of campaigns, the movements of men and machines. At war's end, it was again the pen that helped mark the transition to peace. Treaties were signed in ink. Documents of surrender bore signatures made by pens held with steady, solemn hands. The act of signing, so quiet, so unceremonious, stood in contrast to the noise that had preceded it. Yet in that still moment, the pen reasserted its place, not as a symbol of power, but of order. Understanding, agreement. In the decades that followed, pens carried stories from veterans, notes from memorial services, inscriptions in history books. They signed condolence letters, filled memory books, wrote names on monuments. They helped generations remember, reflect, and, in their own way, begin again. Even now, when digital tools dominate, the pen retains a certain reverence in military life. It is there in the breast pocket of a formal uniform. It is used to record thoughts during deployment, to annotate maps in real time, to sign letters home. There is something grounding in the act, a reminder that even amid the machinery and scale of modern conflict, the human hand still shapes the narrative. And so, in war as in peace, the pen has held its quiet line, not with bravado, but with resilience. It does not seek attention, it does not speak for itself, but it listens, records, remembers. In the years that followed the Second World War, the world tilted once again, this time towards speed, scale, and convenience. New technologies reshaped daily life, and with them, even the humblest tools underwent transformation. Among these, the pen, that quiet companion of thought, found itself at the heart of a quiet, steady revolution, and leading the way was Bic. The name, now almost synonymous with the disposable ballpoint, began with a man, Marcel Biche, a French industrialist with a keen eye for efficiency and a respect for simplicity. Biche saw potential in the ballpoint design, not as a luxury item or a novelty, but as a reliable, everyday tool, one that could be manufactured on a vast scale and sold at a modest price. In 1950, he introduced the Bic Cristal, a clear hexagonal pen with a blue cap and a tiny ball-bearing tip, Its design was spare, unassuming, and profoundly functional. The transparent barrel revealed the ink level. The shape prevented rolling on smooth surfaces, and the lightweight body sat comfortably in the hand. It did not seek to impress, it simply worked. What made the Bic Cristal remarkable was not its complexity, but its precision. The manufacturing process was refined to a degree previously unseen in writing tools. Each ballpoint, a minute sphere of tungsten carbide, was machined to exact tolerances. The ink was formulated for even flow and rapid drying. The result was a pen that wrote smoothly from first stroke to last, with no need for refilling, maintenance, or care. It was quite simply a tool made to be used and then set aside. Mass production brought the price within reach of nearly everyone. School children could carry their own pens. Offices could order them by the box. Shops, banks, hotels all began offering them as standard fare. The pen, once a personal possession, became communal. One need not carry one's own, for a pen could always be found. On a counter, clipped to a pad, offered with a form. Bic's influence spread swiftly. The company expanded beyond France, establishing production facilities across Europe, the Americas, and beyond. Advertising campaigns emphasized reliability and accessibility. The Bic Cristal became the best-selling pen in history. Billions sold, countless words written. It was not an object of affection, but of quiet utility. Yet for all its ordinariness, the Bic held a certain charm. There was honesty in its design, nothing concealed, nothing unnecessary. It did not aspire to elegance. It did not pretend to permanence. It simply allowed the hand to write. And for many, it became the first pen they ever used. Learning letters in a classroom, filling out a test, jotting down a phone number. Its lightness was familiar. Its click of the cap reassuring. In time, Bic introduced variations. 4-color pens, mechanical pencils, markers. But the essence remained unchanged. A pen should be affordable, functional, and dependable. It should not get in the way of thought. It should disappear into the task at hand. Some lamented what the disposable pen symbolized, a shift away from craftsmanship, from care and repair, toward disposability and uniformity. And indeed, the environmental cost of single-use plastics has become more visible with time. Yet, in its own context, the Bic Cristal was a democratizing force. It made writing universal. It gave every hand the means to write, sketch, list, or sign. It lowered the barrier between thought and expression. The Bic pen found its way into every corner of life. It was used to complete census forms and write postcards, to draw diagrams and fill diaries, to sign checks and scrawl shopping lists. It was given freely, lent without concern, and taken for granted, which, in a way, was its greatest achievement. Writers, too, used Bic pens. Georges Perec, the French author known for his linguistic play, reportedly favoured them. So too did artists, doodling in margins, sketching outlines, filling notebooks with the quiet hum of inspiration. The Bic's reliability gave it a place not just in classrooms and offices, but in studios and workshops. Over time, the pen became a cultural object in its own right. Its form was celebrated in design exhibitions. It entered the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, not for luxury or ornament, but for purity of purpose. It was, and remains, a design classic, not in spite of its simplicity, but because of it. Today, the Bic Cristal still writes. It still sits in kitchen drawers, on classroom desks, beside telephone pads. It has outlasted fads, formats, and even rivals. In a world ever more digital, its ink continues to flow, quiet, blue, and unbothered. For some, it is only a pen. For others, a reminder that writing need not be precious to be meaningful, that a thought, quickly captured, can hold as much weight as one laboriously formed, and that even the most ordinary tools, faithfully made, can leave a lasting mark. In the quiet corners of drawers and attics, in the browned pages of exercise books and family ledgers, lies a fading legacy, the once cherished art of penmanship. It was, not so long ago, a daily discipline, taught with rigour and received with pride. Penmanship was more than handwriting. It was posture, rhythm, restraint. It was the physical expression of thought, shaped not only by what one wished to say, but by how one wished to appear. For centuries, good handwriting was a marker of education, of respectability. In schools across Britain and beyond, pupils sat with backs straight and elbows raised, their pens angled just so, copying model lines in copybooks under the watchful eye of a schoolmaster or mistress. The pens they used, first dip pens, later fountain pens, did not forgive poor form. A wavering hand, a too quick movement, a blot of ink, and the page betrayed the error. So one learned to slow down, to breathe, to move with intention. Scripts varied by region and era. The round hand of the Georgian period, the sloping Spencerian of Victorian times, the bold italic promoted by mid-century reformers, each had its advocates, its manuals, its champions. These styles were not merely aesthetic, they carried assumptions about discipline, clarity, and moral bearing. A tidy hand suggested a tidy mind. A confident stroke suggested confidence of character. Even individuality, though not encouraged in early instruction, eventually found its place. A distinctive flair, a loop, a compression of spacing that made a script recognizably one's own. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, penmanship was an art practiced by many and mastered by a few. Professional penmen produced documents of remarkable beauty, diplomas, certificates, advertisements, all rendered in ink with astonishing precision. These were not calligraphers in the ceremonial sense, but craftspeople of the everyday, shaping letters that were legible, expressive, and elegant. Their tools were simple: a steel nib, a bottle of ink, and hours of patient repetition. In businesses, clerks maintained ledgers with immaculate consistency. Each figure, each name, each column was aligned and balanced, forming not just records but visual rhythms. Secretaries, too, were prized for their clear, graceful hands, essential for dictation, for correspondence, for the flow of information. To write well was not just an accomplishment. It was a skill woven into the very functioning of office life. At home, penmanship mattered just as much. Letters to family, entries in a journal, notes of condolence or congratulations, all were written with care. There was pride in a neat signature, in a message written without blot or error. Children copied alphabets under parental guidance. Postcards were penned in well-formed script. Even shopping lists bore traces of this quiet discipline. Handwriting manuals were commonplace, little books with printed examples and blank lines below, inviting repetition. Some were stern and instructional, others were more encouraging, offering praise for effort and examples to emulate. Practice little and often, they advised. Let your hand become familiar with the motion before you seek perfection. There was patience in this process, and reward. But as the century turned and time accelerated, priorities shifted. Typewriters, and later computers, began to replace handwriting in formal settings. Speed, legibility, and replicability took precedence. Penmanship, once part of the core curriculum, began to fade from the classroom. Lessons were shortened, then dropped. What remained was functional, enough to fill a form, to sign a name, to jot a note. The art had receded. This loss, though largely quiet, has not gone unnoticed. For many, the decline of penmanship feels more than practical. It is the erosion of a small, personal ritual, the slowing of the hand, the care given to shape, the intimate connection between thought and movement. A typed sentence, however precise, feels different from one written longhand. The pace is different, the presence different still. And yet penmanship persists, not in the mainstream perhaps, but in side paths and quiet rooms, in calligraphy workshops where broad-nibbed pens trace medieval scripts, in the notebooks of journal keepers where cursive curls across pages with gentle insistence, in the efforts of teachers and parents, reintroducing young hands to loops and lines. Some find their way back to penmanship through necessity, relearning it after years of typing. Others are drawn by aesthetics, by the longing for a slower mode of expression. For in the act of forming letters, each one shaped by hand, influenced by mood, energy, and the surface beneath, there is something profoundly human. Imperfection is part of the appeal. The ink runs slightly dry. A line wavers, the spacing shifts. Yet the result is personal, irreplaceable. Penmanship may no longer be a requirement, but it remains for those who practice it a quiet joy, a way of marking time, a trace of presence, a form of thought made visible and uniquely one's own. In our present world, where screens illuminate our faces and keyboards capture our thoughts with effortless speed, the pen has become something of a quiet outlier. It still exists, of course, resting in drawers, clipped to notebooks, handed over at post offices and reception desks, but it no longer holds the central place it once did. In the digital age, pens have stepped aside, no longer at the forefront of communication, but waiting patiently in the background. And yet, even now, they endure, not out of necessity, but through something gentler, something quieter, a lingering affection. The shift did not happen all at once. In the late 20th century, as personal computers entered homes and workplaces, the pen still reigned in many aspects of life. Notes were taken by hand. Forms were filled out with a blue or black ballpoint. Children learned cursive in school, and letters were still exchanged between friends, folded and stamped and dropped into post boxes. But year by year, word processors, emails, and text messages began to overtake the handwritten page. The pen, once the trusted tool of thought, became a choice, not a requirement. And yet, despite its retreat from the center of our routines, the pen has refused to disappear. Its presence has simply changed, from utility to intention. When we choose to write by hand today, it is usually for a reason beyond efficiency. We write to slow down, to focus, to connect. There is a quiet deliberateness in picking up a pen that no touchscreen or keyboard quite replicates. Consider the handwritten note, a rarity now, but all the more meaningful for it. A thank you card, a birthday message, a few lines inside a book cover. These gestures carry a sense of care, of time taken. The pen's mark is unmistakably personal. It bears the pressure of the hand, the rhythm of breath, the small irregularities that make the words feel lived. Journaling, too, has experienced a quiet resurgence. In the midst of digital overwhelm, more and more people return to the page, not out of nostalgia, but as a form of grounding. The scratch of pen on paper offers a texture, a tactility that brings one into the present moment. The pen becomes not just a tool for recording thought, but for clarifying it. It moves more slowly than the mind, encouraging a kind of pacing, a gentle discipline Educational settings have also begun to recognize the benefits of handwriting, especially in the early years. Studies suggest that writing by hand engages different cognitive processes than typing, reinforcing memory, supporting concentration, and fostering comprehension. Some schools have reintroduced cursive instruction. Others have encouraged the use of notebooks alongside tablets. The pen, it seems, still has something to teach. Even in professional life, where emails and spreadsheets dominate, the pen maintains a foothold. Meetings begin with handwritten agendas. Planners are filled with inked appointments. Some still prefer to outline ideas in longhand before committing them to a screen. The pen here acts as a bridge between thought and action, between planning and doing. And then there are those who take joy in the pen itself, in its feel, its weight, its flow. Fountain pens have found a devoted following, their ink-stained nibs a reminder that writing can be both functional and beautiful. Specialty stationery shops, once thought obsolete, have found renewed interest. People seek out the right pen, the right paper, the right shade of ink. Not because they must, but because they want to. In this way, the digital age has not erased the pen, it has distilled its purpose. Stripped of necessity, it now speaks of choice, a quiet rebellion against uniformity, a return to the personal, the tangible, the slow. It is no longer a conveyor of information alone, but of presence. Designers too have taken note. Many pens today blend form and function with subtle elegance, minimal barrels, balanced grips, smooth glides. Others celebrate history, echoing the curves of vintage models, the gleam of brass or lacquer. A good pen still invites use, still invites care. Even technology has made room for the pen. Digital styluses, shaped like their analog predecessors, mimic handwriting on glass tablets. They promise the best of both worlds, the feel of a pen, the convenience of a screen. Yet for many, the original remains unmatched. There is something irreplaceable in the way ink pools slightly at the end of a word, in the way a pause leaves a mark, in the way a line once drawn cannot be undone. So, though the pen may no longer be the tool we reach for first, it is still there, waiting, unhurried. It belongs not just to the past, but to the quieter parts of the present. And in a world increasingly defined by speed and abstraction, the pen offers something simple and enduring, the quiet satisfaction of making a mark. In dusty drawers and velvet-lined cases, in antique shops and quiet study corners, there exists a world apart, a world where pens are not just tools, but treasures. This is the realm of collectors, those who, with care and curiosity, preserve the long and varied lineage of the writing instrument. Here, each pen is more than a vessel for ink. It is a piece of history, a whisper from a different time, resting gently in the hand. Collecting pens is, for many, not an act of nostalgia, but of appreciation. It begins with an object, perhaps an old fountain pen found in a relative's desk, or a childhood memory of a favourite writing tool. And from that first quiet fascination, a slow and thoughtful habit may take root. The collector begins to notice details, the curve of a nib, the threading of a cap, the way a clip is shaped or a logo embossed. One pen leads to another. Soon, a shelf is cleared, a box is acquired, a catalogue begins to form. Fountain pens often take pride of place in such collections. Their variety is remarkable, from early eyedroppers and lever fillers to piston-driven and cartridge-fed designs. Some are ornate with chased silver or inlaid lacquer, while others are modest, their elegance lying in restraint. A pen from the 1920s might bear the Art Deco lines of its time. A model from the 1950s might reflect the streamlined optimism of mid-century modernity. Each carries, in its design, something of the era in which it was made. Names become familiar: Parker, Schaefer, Pelican, Waterman, Mont Blanc, each with its own history, its own innovations. The Parker duofold, bold and brightly coloured, was once called the Big Red and became a symbol of modern style. The Mont Blanc 149, with its deep resin body and gold nib, became a mark of distinction, favoured by diplomats and writers alike. Yet for many collectors, the charm lies not in prestige, but in personality, in the lesser-known models, the regional variations, the small quirks that make a pen unique. Beyond fountain pens, the collector may venture into ballpoints, rollerballs, dip pens, and even quills. A vintage Bic, still in its original packaging, can hold just as much fascination as a handcrafted Japanese urushi lacquer pen. The pleasure is in the noticing, the details overlooked by others, the slight shift in design between two models made a year apart, the softness of an older steel nib, the faded traces of ink in a barrel hinting at past use. Pen shows and fairs offer quiet gatherings for like-minded souls, not bustling markets, but steady, murmuring affairs where pens are passed hand to hand, tested, discussed. Sellers display their wares not with sales pitches, but with stories. This one, they might say, was made just after the war. Or, you'll find the nib on this model has a bit of flex, perfect for a gentle hand. There is a shared language, a shared rhythm. It is not about acquisition, but connection. And then there are the accessories, inkwells of cut glass and brass, pen cases lined in silk, blotters bearing advertisements from a century ago. These, too, find their place among the collection, each a part of the writing ritual. Some collectors focus here, tracing the evolution of the writing desk, the habits that once shaped daily life. A Victorian desk stand, a travel writing set from the 1930s, the ephemera of a quieter age. Restoration becomes a gentle craft. A pen, long unused, is cleaned, its feed flushed, its nib polished. Sack fillers are replaced, cracks mended. The goal is not to make the pen new, but to make it usable, to allow it to write again after years of silence. There is satisfaction in this, a sense of stewardship, of honouring what came before. Collectors often write with their pens. They do not remain idle. Ink is chosen with care. A blue-black for its depth, a soft sepia for its warmth. Letters are written, journals filled, notes passed. The pens are not merely admired, but lived with, and in use they reveal themselves fully, their balance, their flow, their voice. To collect pens is, in the end, to collect moments, not grand or sweeping, but personal and tactile. A pen that once signed a contract, one that filled exam pages, one that wrote love letters or apologies, or poems never shown. These objects, though silent, are rich with presence. And so, in homes and studies around the world, the pen finds refuge. It is cleaned, cared for, quietly displayed. Not for show, but for remembrance, for the joy of slowness, for the pleasure of something made well, held in the hand, and brought to life once more. There are objects that drift through our lives, quiet and unremarked, until one day they're gone, and in their absence we feel something missing. The pen is one such object. It rarely asks for attention. It is picked up, used, set down, and yet in those small moments, repeated thousands of times across years, it gathers something more than ink. It gathers memory. Think of the pen you used in school, perhaps light in the hand, a slim barrel with blue ink that left faint smudges on your palm. It may have been a standard issue, handed out at the beginning of term, but the feel of it, the slight drag across lined paper, the click of the cap, the curve of your handwriting then, all of it remains, tucked somewhere quiet in the mind. Or the pen a parent kept near the telephone, used for notes, messages, reminders. It might have rested in a mug or balanced on the edge of a newspaper. The ink might have run a little dry toward the end, but still it wrote reliably until it vanished one day, or was replaced or lost among papers, and even so, its presence lingers. Pens appear in moments of transition. A pen signs a lease, a wedding register, a condolence card. A pen writes the first page of a diary or the final words of a letter never sent. These moments are often solemn or joyful or quietly resolute. The pen itself does not remember, but we do. And when we see it again, or one like it, the memory rises, slow and clear. Writers often speak of favourite pens, the one that fits the hand just right, the one that seems to glide a little more smoothly, the one that has become, over time, almost an extension of thought. It's not always the finest or the rarest, but the one most used, the one worn gently by habit and time. Some pens are gifts, a graduation present, a retirement token, a gesture between friends, inscribed perhaps with a name or date, carried for years, even if only used on occasion. Its presence reassures, not for its utility, but for what it represents, a connection, a chapter, a pause in the passage of time. In archives and attics, old pens are sometimes found tucked inside boxes of letters or notebooks, the ink long dried, the nib dulled, but the pen still there, once held, once used. A fountain pen with a gold nib, maybe, or a plastic ballpoint from a conference now forgotten. Each one holds a thread, however fine, that ties back to someone's hand, someone's words. The pen, after all, is a witness. It sits quietly as ideas take shape, as emotions find form, as lists are made and crossed out. It does not judge or rush. It waits, and when called upon, it responds, not with flourish, but with quiet fidelity. There is a tenderness in this, a kind of companionship. A pen is not needed, in the strictest sense, by many of us anymore. We type, we tap, we dictate, but still we return to it, for notes, for sketches, for signatures, for the way it feels to make a mark that is unmistakably ours. Even the imperfections carry weight. The smudge where the ink was still wet, the hesitation in a line, the margin note, barely legible, capturing a thought that could not wait. These things are absent from digital text, but they persist in handwriting, and behind every mark is the pen, facilitating, recording, remembering. Children learn to write with oversized pencils, but eventually they graduate to pens. That moment, often small and unheralded, marks a quiet rite of passage. The ink is permanent now. The mistakes cannot be erased so easily. There is responsibility in it, and pride. Elderly hands, grown slower with age, may still reach for a pen each day, to jot a shopping list, to fill a crossword, to underline a passage in a book. The act is familiar, the muscle memory deep, the connection to one's own past palpable. In the end, the pen is not simply a tool, it is a participant in our personal histories. It holds no opinions, it asks no questions, but it receives everything, thoughts, tasks, emotions, and carries them forward in ink. And perhaps that is why, even now, in an age of endless alternatives, we still keep them close. A pen in the drawer, one in the bag, one just for writing in cards. They are not relics. They are reminders that what we say matters, that how we say it leaves a trace, and that even the quietest instruments can carry a life's worth of memory, one line at a time.